Welcome to KBcast, the podcast for security executives, interviewing people from around the globe on how organizations can operate smarter and stay safer. Here's Carissa Breen.
Nathan Clarke from Verizon, and we spoke about his experience in working in defence and how his career evolved into the private sector. Nathan and I spoke about SOCs, insourced and outsourced, plus a few things to think about to implement into your SOC. Hey Nathan, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. We like to start our podcast off with talking about yourself and your journey. So talk to me a little bit more about where you started and what you're doing now.
I grew up on computers. My father, bought me a VIC-20, a Commodore VIC-20 computer, and I had a lot of basic computers in the 80s and through the early 90s. I had Apples and IBM compatible computers, and I just was content to just sort of nerd out most of the time. I got to a point, 18, I needed to decide what I wanted to do with my life. I didn't really have much of an idea. I knew that I really enjoyed IT. But my father sort of compelled me, join the army, do it for a few years and, that'll give you a little bit of, pocket money and you can decide what you want to do after you get out of the army. 20 years later, I was still in the army. And I was, thoroughly enjoying myself. And in all that time, I did actually role as an IT person in the army. Initially as a storeman and a bit of a pseudo IT guy in the big logistical battalion that I was in, and then I became a full-time IT person in the Royal Australian Signals Corps, where I was deployed, in various theatres of war and on many exercises and very interesting and varied places. And I did actually start to get into security very early in that career, and I got very interested in hacking in the early 2000s. Throughout my progression as a soldier, I got heavily involved in the certification and accreditation of networks, which is very focused on controls and prevention and hardening of operating systems and environments and the protection of information. So I did a lot of GRC throughout the sort of the middle part of my career. Towards the end, I was fortunate enough to get a posting to the organisation that was called the Australian Defence Force Cyber Incident Response Team, where we got to, monitor and defend against, mostly web and email-based threats to the defence environment. And in those 2 years, I got to handle a lot of, very interesting incidents. I learned an absolute heck of a lot. And it was at that point that I decided that, at some point I'm going to get out of the military, maybe soon, maybe a bit later. It was only about 3 years later, but that I was definitely going to do cybersecurity as a career when I left the Defence Force. And then after that, I got my first cert as a manager working for the Telstra Defence Engagement Project for Defence. And then a few years later, I accepted an offer and joined Verizon, where I am now.
Whoa. Okay. That's, that is definitely an extensive period of time of working in the army. Just out of curiosity, was your dad also in the army as well?
Yeah, he was. In fact, he retired from the army about 18 months before I did. And we both retired we both sort of resigned at the same rank. So.
Wow. That's quite incredible. That's a pretty cool story as well. And when you said before that you knew you were going to jump into cybersecurity, what sort of led you to thinking this is really what I want to do? Was there something that attracted you really into it? Was it the hacking side of things, or was it just you knew it was a growing area and it was in demand at that particular time?
Well, throughout my career, I kind of, deep dived on a few different things at different times. So, at one stage I was, very Cisco and networking oriented. And then, Windows Active Directory came out, and for a time I was very heavily invested in that. Virtualization came along, and I was very invested in that for a time. And I was excited by them all, but not as excited as I was when I finally got to do, cybersecurity and more specifically incident response. That's what really that was the bug that really bit me. And so these days, if my peers in my industry, I tell them, I'm blue to the core, so I'm an enterprise defender. The hacking, I've done a little bit. I wouldn't call myself an overtly competent hacker, but I've done enough to sort of understand the difficulties, and then what informs what I need to know as an enterprise defender,
100%.
So yeah, I'm blue to the core now. I love enterprise defense, and that's what I'm currently doing for Verizon.
On that note, I know you presented recently at the New Orleans SANS SOC Summit. Tell me, what happened and what went down? What did we all miss?
The SANS Security Operations or SOC Summit, is broadly focused on, presentations and content and exchange around, the development of security operations centers. And for this year's summit, there was a lot of focus on, models that can, aid in learning. There's a lot of work being done by practitioners and research to help better understand and apply the lessons that we've learned about security operations. There was some discussion around analyst fatigue. And of course, there's always the usual, talking about our adversaries and their tactics, techniques, and procedures. My particular presentation was focused on use case concept development. So thinking about what use cases we want, and then, how are we going to identify what the information requirements are for those use cases? What's the engineering liability? And then making decisions as to whether or not we do that or we move on to something else based on the availability and feasibility of doing the use case development. So, that was it was a little bit in depth, but I didn't get a lot of time. The best thing is that nobody's going to really miss out on it, especially if they're in Canberra, because I'll be delivering that presentation again at a SANS community night, I think, in September, and I'm just working out those details with SANS now.
Okay. All right, well, we'll get us across the details and we'll drop it in the show notes below so people can check that out. Talk to me about analyst fatigue. What do you mean by that?
So analyst fatigue is, it comes down to a couple of different factors. It's, how work is being presented to them, and then how much work. What's the level of analytics that they're expected to do? Are they going to be doing very basic probabilistic analytics, or are they going to be doing something a bit more thorough and leaning right down into sort of determinative type analytics? So they're doing the analysis all the way to the point where they've got a root cause analysis and, complete understanding as to the incident, which will then inform the response. So there are varying factors that contribute to analyst fatigue, but the common one is just, too many alerts. So that's certainly a SOC that has a trouble in the processes that support the development of the CMs and the presentation of work, which is an indicator of where that SOC is in its maturity.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense now that you've identified those two areas of concern. Let's talk about SOCs now, and the more specifics on how all of this world, what it looks like. Talk me through your experience in developing SOCs from the ground up. What's involved in this process? And I say this because you're well aware that in recent years there's been a lot more little SOCs popping up, whether that's within an internal organization, but also MSSPs managing that for clients as well. So I'm really keen to understand what your experience is. Yeah,
well, I think what a SOC is can vary, very distinctly between two different organizations. And, some of the factors that go into deciding, what a SOC is going to look like, whether or not it's insourced, outsourced, they're less of a concern than, things like the model and workforce structure of the SOC, the scale and size of the enterprise that needs to be defended. Is there going to be a single team that does end-to-end incident handling, or two teams, one focused on analysis and the other focused on response? What's the analytical effort? Is the analysis going to be deterministic or probabilistic? Is it going to be based on expected volumes? What's the access to information going to be in order to enrich investigations? Is it going to be 24/7 or business hours? Is it going to be, how much engineering is in there to support the ongoing detection development and the sort of the continual service improvement? And what are the other enablers and impactors? Cyber threat intelligence, what's the IT service management landscape look like in that enterprise? what's the expected stakeholder engagement, interfacing with the rest of IT operations, reporting, and of course costs are always a factor and impact many of these decisions around, how you want to model your SOC.
So I know you spoke before about splitting the teams up potentially into response and then analysis. A CIO says, okay, cool, we're going to start developing a SOC. What should be the initial first questions that they should be looking to start this development process?
I guess what are their risks? What risks are we trying to mitigate? So if most organizations that I've worked with will have quite a thorough, risk matrix. And particularly from my experience in defense, they have a risk management plan that's a requirement of every accredited network. And the focus traditionally in risk management plans is to have controls that, mitigate expected risk. But what a SOC can do is add extra treatment options to those risks. So if it was me, I'd be asking, what services or what treatments can a SOC provide me to further reduce the risks that I have for my organization? I think that would be probably the first question I'd want to ask.
Okay. And just from also your experience breaking the two teams up, is that would you say that's a preferred method, or I guess that's also dependent on the size of the organization and the size of the SOC, but what would be your go-to in terms of how that would look like in terms of the team structure?
There was a time when I would have preferred just a single team end to end, but I think that has trouble scaling to extremely large enterprises. And there are different, skills and training requirements for analysis and conducting the response actions. So I think that end to end, I've worked in two SOCs where we did end to end, and currently with Verizon we have separate resources for the analysis and then another resource for the response. And there are advantages to splitting it. You can focus more of your tradecraft and training and what's required to bring those analysts who have to do the incident handling to the point of determination. You can focus certain types of training on that part of the incident response process. And then there are the incident responders or the response team. Their focus will be on engagement with IT operations and being that that middle ground between the analysis or the analysts and their determination and IT operations and what IT operations need to do in a very quick fashion to carry out responses. So again, different set of skills, different engagement to the enterprise, and having two different teams allows a SOC to scale to a larger size if it needs to, depending on how much information and how much monitoring that they need to do of the environment.
Okay, that adds a lot more clarity around that question. And I know before you spoke about insourced and outsourced. So let's jump into that. From your experience, what do you believe the benefits are of insourced and outsourced SOCs?
I hate to say it, but it depends, because it comes down to the multitude of different ways that, both an insourced or an outsourced are integrated into the organization and into the IT operations. But there are distinct differences that, there's obviously going to be a contract there. And depending on the service provider and the customer, that the contract it might be a source of frustration if there are sort of quite constrained, service terms in that contract. It could be a hurdle, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a hurdle. And I don't want to sort of toot my own horn or Verizon's own horn, but what I've found with Verizon since joining the company 18 months ago is that they generally have an approach, especially for the advanced SOC product. As I run the advanced SOC for APAC, they definitely have a view to establish a partnership, rather than a traditional organized sort of an organization and supplier relationship. And the ASOC is not the only resource that Verizon provides in terms of establishing a security service for a customer. We can provide other resources to help stitch it all together to make it work. So I think it really comes down to how well that relationship works between the SOC and the organization at large, whether it's insourced or outsourced. I've seen challenges on insourced SOCs that you wouldn't think would be expected for an in-source SOC. I've been in the situation where an in-source SOC has had, we've had authorization to do quite, large response actions, such as shutting down the internet for the entire organization.
Okay.
And we had conditions that would allow us to do that would authorize us to just walk across the floor to our gateway team and say, shut it down. But the same team, we weren't able to just delete an email from someone's inbox. We had to go and, raise a ticket and get support and authorization for that to happen, and just go through the normal IT service management process. So, in-source teams can have their challenges, as can outsourced teams. So, it's quite interesting. I don't think there's probably some common threads there. But yeah, I think it sort of comes down to the each organization, supplier, and SOC.
Can you drill down a little bit more on some of the challenges regarding an outsourced SOC?
Our challenges are about keeping that communication going, making sure that everybody's sort of dancing along to the beat of the same drum, really. And in the advanced SOC for APAC, we're set up to be able to provide support to more than just one customer. So our at the moment, we've got one large enterprise customer that keeps us, quite relatively busy. In the future, we're going to have, multiple customers. And so our challenges are going to be, how do we, fairly apportion our time in support of all of our customers? And those are things we're thinking about right now. As a SOC manager for a SOC that's going to provide enterprise-grade monitoring and detection for multiple customers, that sort of pushes me into a little bit of a more of a strategic position where I need to start to think about, and relying on my senior analysts to be able to, conduct operations while I make sure that we're continually improving both on our processes and getting ready to be able to support other customers as well, and making sure that we're executing absolutely everything in the contracts that we have, regardless of how many customers we're supporting. So, so multi-homed SOCs would be the distinct interesting aspect of what we're doing, that obviously an in-source SOC is not going to have that same challenge.
Let's talk about more of the in-sourcing SOCs. Now, do you believe people are building their own SOCs to enhance their street cred? Like I said, there's been a lot more of them popping up in recent years, but the capability they have developed is still quite not there in terms of a technical point of view. What's your opinion on that?
I think that, as an industry, I think we're still learning, particularly in Australia. I felt that in the past we've been very focused on, prevention as a panacea, and less on other risk mitigation or risk treatments, such as the things that a SOC and a CERT team can do and provide to an organisation. So the other aspect of it is that, one of the other speakers that I spent time with when I was at the SOC Summit was a fellow named Chris Sanders, and he delivers training through his own, training business called Applied Network Defence. And he's been recently speaking about, the issues that we have in the industry, and that, information security is in a growing state of cognitive crisis. So where we have plentiful knowledge, but the selection and application of that knowledge is challenging in many places. I think that, I think people are still trying to catch up. I think the technology's there. I think that there should be better opportunities for a SOC to inform decisions around the architecture. But I think we're still. I think if it's the bottom line, and I think we're just still learning, and we need to find ways to take all that knowledge that's being generated and figure a way of applying it in a meaningful way that enables our continual improvement.
Now, that's a really interesting response, which leads me to my next question about executives. What should executives be looking for in terms of reporting? Now, I've got a reporting background myself, so I'm definitely keen to hear your opinion on this. And there's obviously a lot of information being gathered, as you mentioned before, about the analyst fatigue. But what do you believe? What do you believe is missing in terms of the mark due to the information overload?
Yeah, well, it's somewhat related, isn't it? There's plenty of information. What exactly do we need to select in order to address certain information requirements? So I haven't seen a lot of broad consistency between what executives above a SOC want, and because those organisations will change their information requirements depending on what their view is of a security service. There are some common themes. So tell us about incident metrics. What are the critical and targeted attacks? Tell us about X vulnerability. But where some organizations and executives that are responsible for reporting to the board on the effectiveness of their security program, some will be focused on what is just the return on investment. What's the cost, and is that cost justified? And others are struggling to extract the value from all of that information that you mentioned. So, there is a lot of information. What is it exactly that we need to know from all of this monitoring and detection that tells us that, again, and it's sort of eventually it'll climb its way up to, are we getting a return on our investment? And these things change over time as we continue to push through this cognitive crisis. The requirements are going to refine and they're going to change. And the people that are asking for this information or setting the information requirements, they'll bring their own lack of or greater amount of knowledge and experience with them every time they go to inform what those information requirements are that they ask of us.
It's about telling a story, because I know in my experience of working in a large financial institution, that was my whole role. And by demonstrating the correct reporting in ways that made sense to executives, that they could see, hey, we're actually going to need more money in this particular area, as we can see it's trending down this month. Why is that? Instead of actually deriving insights off it, or else it's sort of just numbers that people they probably don't really care about at the end of the day. Like, okay, cool, thanks for the report, security people. What does this actually mean? So I think there actually has to be more of a communications piece wrapped around that report that actually makes sense for people to actually want to look at it twice and potentially put money against it.
I absolutely agree. I think narrative is absolutely critical in taking that data that we're generating, picking the right thing, and then putting a narrative over the top that tries to explain it. I think telling a story is probably one of the best ways to. There's a place for metrics. There's a place for numbers and graphs and line diagrams and all that sort of stuff. But I think a narrative should come with all of that.
When you said before that the industry is still learning, do you think that people who are gathering this information still not quite sure what they should be reporting on? Do you still think there's an area of improvement there, or do you think they've absolutely nailed it?
Yeah, I think that those who set the requirements for the reporting, in setting those requirements, there should be a two-way conversation between the SOC manager and what other stakeholders, including IT operations. I mean, we are a component of IT operations, and so there should be a discussion and continual reviews around what those information requirements are. And don't hold an expectation that you're going to get it perfect the first time. I mean, as I said, we're evolving, we're learning, and this cognitive crisis that we're in should drive a need to do those constant reviews and asking ourselves questions and making sure that information has value at the various levels that information needs to travel up.
Where do you believe the evolution of the SOC will be in terms of the changes and the direction?
Well, I think we're still trying to learn to walk on dry land. But it would be nice to see, again, more continual refinement of standards that can inform SOCs and their processes. I would like to see more focus on what's the continual improvement processes that drive detection development in a SOC. I'd like to see some more of that out there. That there's certainly a lot of research and there's a lot of information being developed about it, and I've got my own models that I use to try to make sense and try to track how well detection development is progressing. We've got other issues around trying to defeat the lack of visibility. I'm the security practitioner that will tell people I want everything in the SIEMs, and some people get a bit concerned about that. And I acknowledge that cost is a problem, and vendors they set a pretty high bar in terms of cost for an organisation or a large enterprise who wants to try to onboard everything into a SIEMs. That can be a very costly
of course, and logs.
Proposition.
Cost of the logs.
Yeah. So logs, and this is another problem, is that logs are one thing that you want to put in your SIEMs. There's a lot of information that you want to put in there that's organizational specific stuff that's not being fed in real time. You want to put things in there such as your IP address ranges, the geography of your environment. You want to put information in there about the people who have privileged access. What are their working hours? Where do they work? Change management. Put all the change management information in the SIEMs, because that can help you distinguish the use of privileged on a normal basis versus an abnormal basis. So there's a lot of other information that should be put into the SIEMs, and trying to defeat that visibility and trying to improve correlation relies on as much information as you can feed into it and as much information about the organisation that you can hold in the SIEMs. And the other thing we've got happening in the industry right now is SOAR platforms are coming. So security orchestration, automation and response platforms are starting to come along, and they are not a replacement for SIEMs, but they'll certainly help improve our efficiency. And every time we solve a problem, there's a new problem, and the new problem that SOARs are going to introduce to us is the need to consider increasing our engineering FTE. So having engineering is going to be necessary for a SOAR that's going to be heavily reliant on integrating via API. So we're going to need to have engineers there constantly watching and constantly monitoring and constantly developing our SIEMs and our SOARs when we have them both.
You respond when you say when we solve one problem, there's another one.
Yeah.
This is the way it is, unfortunately. But top 5 things that people should do to improve their SOC.
Okay.
Can only be 5 though.
Only 5? Well, I could write 5 and then I could write, 1A, 1B, 1C.
Yeah,
but,
okay, got you. Okay.
But certainly, number 1 for me is detection development, good engineering in our SOCs. Detection development is what enables SOC to continually improve. The SOCs that atrophy and become irrelevant are those that just think incident response and they onboard everything in their first few months and then they just let it go. That detection development is critical for the ongoing evolution of the SOC and the ongoing improvement of the presentation of work to analysts, which leads me to analysts. So number 2 on my list would be look after your analysts, deliver them good leadership, and make sure that you involve them in the development of the SOC. Analyst fatigue can be helped by a great many things, including involving them in the development of the SOC, but also just really delivering that good leadership that they need and making sure that they feel like they're a part of a very important function in the IT operations in an organisation. So looking after them, looking after their welfare, and particularly if you've got shift workers, I've found that looking after a 24/7 shift team to be very challenging. Alert fatigue can set in a lot sooner, and you need to be there for them. So it's really important to look after your analysts. Number 3 would be exercising your teams and processes and disaster recovery and business continuity. I've had the fortune of working in a SOC that had its own pen tester. So I started exercising my team. It was also a great way of testing detection, but it's also a great way of testing teams. So rather than just using pen testers for the exclusive purpose of penetrating something, it's a great way to actually get them to exercise the incident responders and the detection. And so a little bit of purple teaming is a fantastic idea. Number 4 would be keep learning. Don't fool yourself into thinking that you know enough. So again, it comes back down to that cognitive crisis. Keep trying to learn, keep looking at models, and make sure that you're applying information in a meaningful way that will continue to improve the SOC. And number 5, SOC managers, analysts, regardless of the organisation that you're in, get together and have a drink and talk about things and support each other. I know that competitive advantage can make that feel like an uncomfortable process, an uncomfortable prospect, but we need a network of support while we're trudging our way through this cognitive process, and that can still respect competitive boundaries. So get together. There are some really great professional organisations that are out there, such as ACER, ACSC, and various other, ACS, and various other organisations. So get together and have a drink and talk about things, and respect those competitive boundaries, but try to help each other out and support each other. Those are my 5 things.
Awesome. Nailed it. I think those are really, really good. I think that's very comprehensive in how you talked through them as well. So Nathan, I've had an absolute pleasure of you coming on our show today. Where can people reach out to you? Where can they find you?
I'm on LinkedIn. That's probably where I spend most of my time exchanging and talking about things. I'm on Twitter, but I'm a bit of a lurker there. I tend to just keep an eye on those people who are teaching me things. But occasionally I'll tweet at Geek Nathan. That's GeekNathn. So I'm in those two platforms for information security.
Thank you so much.
No, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.